Good morning. Thank you all for coming. It couldn't be a better timed event with some of the key figures in this debate. We're honoured to be able to welcome them, no one more so than our founding chairman, Michael Gove, who's been a key player in the debates on these matters over many years. I also should say that this is not just about traditional definitions of the union, but it's also about widening it into a wider concept of a new form of civic unionism, also looking in our future work programme at unionism between the generations, unionism between various communities throughout this country, and unionism between various socio-economic strata to forge a new national consensus. Michael, thank you for taking the time to come and speak to us today. Jason Cowley of New Statesman, as you know, will chair this session, do the question and answer. We look forward to much healthy audience participation in the finest traditions of policy exchange. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you, Jason. Thank you all for coming along this morning. Pleasure to be here. The state of our union is strong. So reports the American president in his, sadly not yet her, State of the Union address every new year. It's a ringing proclamation of faith in the future of the United States, which is articulated with confidence every year, a confidence which reflects that amazing nation's capacity for renewal and reform over political cycles and human generations. Now, one doesn't need to be an uncritical fan of America, or indeed any of its presidents, to recognize the great republic's resilience and strength. And it's a strength which is drawn from, indeed rooted in, diversity. America is a creedal nation, one shaped by the power of ideas, not defined by ties of blood. And its creed is best defined in its motto, E pluribus unum, from many, one. From multitudes, from diversity, comes unity, flows strength. That principle, while powerfully expressed in the story of America, of course, did not have its beginnings in the US. It began here. This country, the United Kingdom, was the original set of United States. Out of the pluribus of Welsh and English, Irish and Scottish, Celtic and Anglo-Saxon, Catholic and Protestant, Stuart and Hanoverian, refugees from Bourbon oppression or Tsarist pogroms, arrivals who came on the Empire Windrush or fled from battlefields in Bosnia, out of that many have come one, the British people. The citizens of this United Kingdom, who have the same rights, are subject to the same laws, have the same say in choosing the government, and the same stake in our shared future. That principle is precious. The principle of equality among our citizenry in a country governed by agreed rules and common institutions. And that principle is unionism. And as long as we remember that and renew that spirit in every generation, the state of our union will be strong. Unionism is, I know, not seen in the same way by everyone. Some see in unionism a nostalgia for empire, which was already out of date when it was embraced by Joe Chamberlain more than a century ago. Some seek to associate unionism indelibly with Ireland's troubles. Others present unionism as the gateway to Scotland or Wales's deindustrialisation and decline in the 1980s. Unionism, like all political beliefs which have survived over the generations, will of course have aspects of its history open to criticism. But its very durability over the years points to its ability to command loyalties and speak to values which are enduring. And unionism, in the British context, speaks to some specific attachments. To institutions, from the Crown and Parliament to the National Health Service, to organisations which represent the best of us, from the BBC to the armed services, and to people who fly the flag on all our behalves, from Team GB outperforming rivals at the Olympics, to Gary Oldman in Darkest Hour at the Oscars. But deeper even than those attachments for unionism are the underpinning institutions which embody the principle of equal respect for every individual. These institutions accord respect, freedom, and dignity to individuals by virtue of their shared citizenship, rather than because of possession of any specific identity. They include our common law traditions, which guarantee the accused the presumption of innocence, safeguard them from arbitrary punishment, and allow them to take the government to court. Alongside the impartial rule of law, we have an independent parliamentary democracy, which gives every vote equal value and requires MPs to serve all their constituents equally, rather than favouring particular communities or interests. And our common law traditions in parliamentary democracy also depend on our traditions of free speech and vigorous dissent, which mean that the state cannot license or suppress views from individuals who challenge orthodoxy. All of these freedoms celebrate the idea of the radical dignity of the individual citizen, imbued with worth and respect, irrespective of their membership of any group or collective. These unionist principles are themselves the product of unionist politics and unionist history. They reflect the liberal ideals of John Locke, which shaped political thinking at the time of the original Act of Union between England and Scotland. And they're also an expression of the worldview of those Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, such as David Hume and Adam Smith, who flourished in an 18th century Edinburgh anchored in the Union. These values have underpinned the growth in personal freedom and social progress which have characterised life in democracies in the last 200 years. But while these ideas are powerful and durable, and these values are progressive and liberal, they depend upon continuity in political structures and institutions to remain strong. And that's why it's important, as this conference asks us to reflect on how we rejuvenate and strengthen both the arguments and the institutions which keep these unionist principles healthy and relevant. And that means that we need to be alert to the forces and arguments which are in opposition to these principles, which stand against the unionist tradition. One particular political trend that stands against these principles is the current growth of identity politics. There is an increasing tendency on left and right in North America and across Europe for people to look at political questions through the prism of identity. The identitarians want to move away from liberal principles of equal treatment for all, colourblindness, and respect for individual rights. Instead, they embrace a politics which divides society into contending groups and demands that people define themselves by their group membership rather than as autonomous individuals. Those who embrace identity politics want to pit their group against others, oppressors or outgroups, in a conflict for recognition, rights and resources. Identity politics involves an assertion that group membership confers certain specific rights or benefits on members which are denied to others, and attempts by others to encroach on the in-group's rights must be rebuffed. So, an insistence that an individual should check their privilege before speaking, and therefore pipe down if they don't fit in, or avoid cultural appropriation, in other words, know their place in the world if they want to get a hearing, is a sign of left identity politics. And there is an equally concerning identity politics on the right. You hear it when there is an appeal to defend men's rights, which is an attempt to make gender a cause of conflict, not an aspect of character. Or when some politicians suggest that our borders should be closed to people because of their faith or origin. Those are just some of the signs of a growing right identity politics. Both right and left identity politics stand in opposition to the principles of genuine respect for diversity, of opinion and view as well as background and culture, and both of them subvert the idea of respecting the radical equality of the individual by demanding that some are owed more respect and more equality than others. Unionism, because it allows diversity to flourish through acceptance of common laws, because it accords equal value to individuals, whatever their background and tradition, because its allegiances and attachments are to Magna Cartas, Bills of Rights, Great Reform Acts and Golden Jubilees, not tribal, cultural, sexual or divisive totems, stands in direct opposition to identity politics. And unionism is more, much more, than an anemic liberalism which argues in abstractions and has no pull on the heart. The story of liberty, which is woven through the history of Britain, even though there are many bleak and black moments in our past, has an emotional reach which commands loyalty and affection still. Unionists take pride in the fact that our institutions have endured and have helped provide a warm home for so many from such distinct and diverse backgrounds. Those forces and movements in our politics which are most opposed to unionism tend to be those most susceptible to or animated by identity politics. Whether it's a Scottish nationalism that conflates truly progressive politics with a superior virtue that apparently can only really come from living north of the border, or the Little Englanderism, which feels that it's not just the Cross of St. George that needs a white background. A politics opposed to the diversity of the United Kingdom in either direction privileges identity over inclusivity. But if unionism is a political outlook that stands opposed to identity politics, how does it fare in a post-Brexit world, where we're constantly told the assertions of identity are becoming louder and centrifugal political forces are growing more powerful? Well, the truth curious as it may appear to some, is that Brexit has, certainly so far, strengthened unionist currents in our politics, not weakened them. Take Scottish nationalism. Since the vote to leave the European Union in 2016, support for Scotland leaving the United Kingdom has diminished. The Scottish National Party's vigorous championing of another independence referendum has led it to drop in the polls, lose seats at the last general election, and now lose momentum and authority in office. It faces further losses in future elections at the hands of all three major unionist parties, the Liberal Democrats, Labour, and above all, the resurgent Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. In the aftermath of Brexit, the Scottish Conservative Party secured its best general election result for 30 years and now represents working-class communities from Alloa to Ayrshire at Westminster for the first time in living memory. Scottish nationalism is not the only movement which has played with identity politics and which is in retreat. The decline, indeed effective eclipse, of the United Kingdom Independence Party is another blow to identity politics. To be sure, UKIP had a range of voices in its ranks, but there was a more pronounced identitarian strain of right-wing politics in its platform than in any other British political party which has ever secured representation in the House of Commons. Once, UKIP could command 4 million votes. Now, its chairman, in an effort to paint an optimistic picture of its future, compared it to the Black Death. And it is also striking that another feature of unionism, the explicit embrace of diversity, has strengthened since Brexit. Britain has become more welcoming to migration since the Brexit vote, as opinion research has confirmed, and liberal commentators such as Sundar Katwala of British Future and Alex Massey of The Times have explained. The act of taking back control has allowed British citizens to show that they can be more welcoming to new arrivals if allowed to be, rather than required to be. And now Britain is one of those EU nations with the warmest attitudes towards migration, mirroring the attitudes in sister countries across the globe, such as Canada and New Zealand. So, far from weakening unionism, Brexit has delivered its supporters a boost and its opponents a check, and in some cases, a reverse. I think that is, at least in part, because the Brexit vote was a vote of confidence in Britain. For the first time in my adult lifetime, we voted to take power back from unaccountable institutions and return it to accountable UK politicians. That is an assertion of belief in Britain, which I think we should celebrate. But supporters of the values that underpin the UK and the diversity which is its strength cannot afford to be complacent. As Policy Exchange's research has shown, there are different divisions which have developed over time in the UK, between the property-owning older generations and the young, who see home ownership receding from their grasp, between London and other metropolitan centres and small-town and provincial Britain, between a more prosperous south and east and a still underperforming north, between those whom David Goodhart has identified as the anywheres, those with the connections and qualifications to move on and up in pursuit of prosperity, and the somewheres, those whose future and loyalties lie close to where they've always known as home. One of the challenges for a new, modern 21st century unionism is to bridge those gaps and heal those divisions, as well as working towards overcoming other tensions laid bare by the referendum campaign, and indeed bringing more fully into the life of the nation those diaspora communities who've made the United Kingdom their home. That is why the work the Policy Exchange is doing under John Bew and David Goodhart on reinventing patriotism, refreshing the mandate of the UK nation-state, and reaching a new national consensus is so important. It's the unionist mission for our times. Because I believe we must increasingly see unionism not just as a belief in the ties that bind England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, or an attachment to the shared institutions that we enjoy across these islands, which have made it possible for us to accommodate diversity and welcome new arrivals. Unionism in the future also needs to be a dynamic, evolving and creative project aimed at ensuring a deeper respect for and radical equality of treatment towards all our citizens. And this is where Brexit also provides potential new opportunities. Opportunities for us to support all our citizens to succeed. I know that in my own departmental area of food, farming, fishing and the environment, Brexit provides opportunities to revive coastal communities that have been in decline, restore landscapes and habitats which have been neglected to health, nurture and new rural enterprises in parts of the country which have been overlooked in the past, and revive local farm enterprises through, for example, helping to sustain an effective network of local collaboration. And, as Policy Exchange has pointed out, outside the EU, we could, if we wished, reform our approach to taxation to support enterprise in less favoured areas, We could adjust corporation tax or create new tax credits for start-up enterprises in regions which currently face lower growth. And we could also establish free ports in those areas as part of a strengthened northern powerhouse. We could also reform government procurement, ensuring that communities we value receive stronger support, whether that's through investing in local food economies or seeing if the lessons from the Preston model of local procurement can be applied more widely. We could look more broadly at how we finance and support enterprise in those communities which have lacked investment in the past. We could organise our financial sector differently, making it easier for those who need capital in poorer areas to secure it. These are all debates that I know Policy Exchange wants to lead, and I would not want to preempt their outcomes. But in considering how Brexit can play a part in bringing Britain together and redistributing opportunity across our union, I believe that Policy Exchange is being true to its modernising foundations. And that is why today's conference is so important, and I wish Policy Exchange and all of you here this morning every success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael. We have, what is the time now? It's 9:25. We have about half an hour before you have to go. So I'll ask a couple of questions, and then I'm going to take questions from the audience. Michael, you said before the EU referendum and afterwards in a column in the Times, and again in your speech, that Brexit will strengthen the union. And you gave examples as to why you believe that. What was missing, I thought, from your speech was some articulation of what a post-Brexit constitutional settlement should be for the United Kingdom. In other words, are you content with the status quo, which Ruth Davidson in a Financial Times column this morning called messy? In other words, we don't have a written constitution, or would you like to see a far-reaching constitutional reappraisal, or indeed a reconfiguration of the union?
I think at the moment we're, well, thank you for that, Jason. I think at the moment we're in the middle of defining the allocation of powers that have come back formally from the European Union, or will come back formally from the European Union. My cabinet colleague David Liddington has been in talks with both the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government about how Clause 11 of the European Union Withdrawal Bill will work in order to ensure that we have powers which are properly exercised, new powers which are properly exercised by those devolved governments, but also UK-wide frameworks in order to ensure that we can work together. And I think while we're in the middle of that work, which is important, it would be premature of me to go beyond that. And I think.
But you must have, as one of our most thoughtful politicians, indeed a former colleague of mine at the Times, one could even call you an intellectual. You must have some ambition for the union.
Yeah, well, I think that what I was trying to develop in the remarks this morning was an analysis of where I think some of the energy and thinking in redefining unionism and modernising unionism should go. So I think it's important, yes, that we should think about the allocation of powers and responsibilities between the UK Parliament and the devolved administrations. And my cabinet colleague Brandon Lewis will be making the argument a little bit later today about the success of devolution and where that might go in the future. But one of the things which I think is important is to recognise that unionism goes beyond simply the formal allocation of powers within the Constitution, but it's a set of principles, and it's a set of principles which I think can apply anew to some of the other divisions and tensions that exist across the United Kingdom. And I think in particular, if one looks at the referendum, and I didn't want to be Pollyanna-ish about things, I think in formal terms, post-Brexit, support for the United Kingdom, for example, in Scotland is greater. Support for diversity and inclusion overall is greater.
When you say it's, the support for the United Kingdom in Scotland is greater, I thought the general election result was very interesting in 2017. And there are now 13 Conservative MPs, I think led brilliantly by Ruth Davidson, the party in Scotland. But do you think also that the SNP made a mistake? Nicola Sturgeon, perhaps, misunderstood her own nationalist base. A third of the SNP vote, as I understand it, voted for Brexit.
Yes.
There's always been a fundamentalist wing of the SNP, the Jim Sillars wing, that wanted to take back control, to use your own phrase, from Westminster, but also from Brussels.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that you're.
So therefore, they loaned their vote to Brexit, to the Brexiteers.
I think that you're absolutely right that there is about a third of the SNP vote or base which wanted to leave the European Union. But I think that what's striking is that some of the votes that the Scottish Conservatives won were from communities and in areas which would not be thought of traditionally as SNP heartlands, and which were the votes of civic-minded and centrist voters who wanted a strong unionist alternative to the Scottish Government and to the Scottish National Party in Westminster. So it is certainly the case that there are people, for example, in the northeast of Scotland, who voted SNP in the past and who voted Conservative at the last election. But I think some of the reasons that they voted SNP in the past were not so much because they felt that they wanted necessarily separation from the UK. It's because that was a way of asserting the specific interests either of the fishing or other communities that they were part of. And if they can see...
Are these the old so-called Tartan Tory communities coming home to the party?
And I think if they see exactly some of the particular interests that priorities and values that they have respected and strengthened in the UK, then I think that their estrangement from the SNP may turn into something more.
You spoke about identity politics, and of course you spoke about the identity politics of the right and also of the left. Is it fair to describe the SNP's politics as identity politics? I mean, there's no one represented from the SNP on the programme today, I think, regrettably, but the SNP believe themselves to be a civic, social democratic party, not a blood and soil nationalist party.
No, I absolutely. But I think that what's striking, and it may be reflected upon Ruth's here, is the if you go online, if you encounter the cybernets,
I have been online occasionally. Yes.
If you encounter the cybernets in their natural territory, then what you don't find is a civilised, civic approach towards debate and inclusivity. You find something very different. And I think that, as you pointed out...
So the cybernets are driven by what? Contempt, hatred, bigotry?
They're driven by a desire to divide and to exclude. That's the most striking thing. The belief that you can only construct a progressive future for the people of Scotland, if you define it as progressive, in a separate nation is striking. There's something else as well. Whenever cases are made for reform of particular institutions, like, say, education in Scotland, the one way in which the SNP rebuts or rejects changes, for example, the establishment of Teach First and so on, is that it's an English import. And I think that you're right that the SNP tries to present as broad a front as possible. And of course, there are people, who vote and.
But all parties are coalitions of.
Yes, but and there are people who support the SNP, very thoughtful people like Andrew Wilson and so on, who I wouldn't want to paint into any particular corner. But I do feel that what the SNP have done is played with identity politics in order to advance their position, and that's rebounded on.
Why do you think the United Kingdom is in crisis?
I don't think it is. I think that all developed Western nations are dealing with the aftermath and the fallout of the 2008 economic crisis.
That, yeah.
But I don't think that the UK. I think the C word would be overused about almost any of those countries.
When you look at a country such as Spain, another monarchical multinational state, that seems to me in crisis too. We could be facing a second referendum anytime soon in Scotland, perhaps over the next 3 to 4 years. I mean, I don't know what your estimation on that is. When do you think the second referendum will be? That suggests to me that the British state is existentially threatened.
I don't think so. I don't think that there is support for a second referendum in Scotland.
I think today is Nicola Sturgeon about to lay out her plans for independent Scottish currency.
Yes, but I think that one of the lessons of the last 2 years is that it's the SNP promising, threatening, holding out the prospect of a second referendum, which has actually been damaging both to their support in Scotland, but also to their capacity to govern effectively. That it really.
So you don't expect there to be a second referendum?
Yes, I mean,
so there won't be.
Well, it's not in my gift.
It's not in your gift.
But I would bet against it.
You'll bet against it. What odds would you give?
I don't know. I wouldn't like to make a book on it.
You wouldn't. I was going to take your bet. Okay. Shall we take some questions? We haven't discussed the English question yet, so I hope someone will raise that. Colin Kidd first, please. Should we take them in 2s or 3s? How do you want to take questions?
Up to you, Jason.
Colin first.
Yes.
And questions rather than statements, please.
Okay. I'm a Scottish unionist.
Congratulations.
I belong to Scotland's double unionist majority. That is the majorities for the Anglo-Scottish Union and the European Union. I agree with your arguments about the principles of unionism and your arguments against identity politics. Where you lose me is why don't your arguments for the principles of unionist politics apply to the European Union?
So,
Professor Kidd is, as everyone knows here, one of our most distinguished academics, so it's very, very difficult to think that I can construct in the space available an argument that does justice to the scale of the question that he poses, but because it invites me to go back and rerun all of the arguments that we had during the referendum campaign. I'd say two things, though, in brief. The first is that Gisela Stewart, my friend and colleague during the referendum campaign, said the European Union is a union that doesn't work, the United Kingdom is one that does. And I think that there are particular reasons why the European Union, because it doesn't have the inbuilt accountability, the feedback loop and the flexibility that the United Kingdom has, is a different political construct, which, while of course conceived in high hopes and while it works for some of its members, I don't believe is working particularly well for all of its members at the moment. And then the second thing that I would say is that the referendum campaign was fought against a backdrop of people predicting that Britain leaving the European Union would lead to damage for the UK as a political construct. And so far, that hasn't come about. And I think that's because voters can draw a distinction, have drawn a distinction between the union that they value and the one that they felt was less important, both to their identity and also to the defence of the political principles in which they believed.
So in other words, Project Fear, as it was called, was excessively alarmist. What does your friend George Osborne now say about that?
He says I'm wrong.
Have more questions, please. Many. Should we take two? With the orange pencil, and then Ian next. Thank you. And then
Thank you. Good morning, Michael. I'm amazed as ever at the brass neck you bring to these things. Some very short points, some of them are questions. Did more than 2% of the electorate vote on an anti-immigrant ticket in the referendum? Second question.
We don't want too many questions. Others want to ask questions as well.
Are leavers identitarians? And 3, have you already started writing our constitution, having succeeded with the English literature national curriculum?
Okay. You might want to answer only one of those. One second. We'll take Ian's question, please.
Okay, I'm going to...
No, the answer to all 3 questions is no.
Right, Ian Watson from BBC. I'm going to ask you about the European Union rather than anything else. The Foreign Secretary was saying today that Brexit supporters shouldn't fear betrayal when it comes to the backstop, but perhaps you're better able to interpret his remarks than I am. I'm not sure if he is saying this is something which will never happen or something which he hopes won't happen. Is it something, in your view, which is a negotiating tactic or something which might be essential after the transition period until something better is put in its place?
Well, the Irish government and the EU27 have sought reassurance that in the event of the future economic partnership not delivering in the time that they would like to see it, arrangements which resolve some of the concerns that they have about the functioning of the Northern Ireland border, that there'll be an arrangement in place which would be strictly time limited in order to ensure that we can continue to have the free flow of goods and citizens across the Irish border. That's a perfectly fair request, and it's one that the government is seeking to meet, because the language that was put forward earlier this year by the European Commission, while it seeks to meet that goal, doesn't meet it in a way that we believe is consistent with the unity of the United Kingdom or the goals that we have in the European negotiations.
Okay.
Well, the whole point about the backstop is that it's intended not to be implemented, but it's there just in case.
Right. You, sir, with your left hand raised in the second row, and then you in the white shirt, gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Euripides, and thank you very much for a forceful principle on unionism, which finds me perfectly agreeable. I have an opinion on these things, but obviously not a say. I'm a sympathetic observer, like many of my colleagues. Why do I see a country divided? Why do I see Conservative Party divided? Why do I see a sense of nostalgia of Empire 2.0 and the resurgence of the Commonwealth in whatever form? Do I live in La La Land, or am I oblivious to reality and I'm getting it fundamentally wrong? Thank you.
When you say a country divided, you mean the United Kingdom?
Yes, exactly. Well, we have division, unfortunately, in Cyprus, but of different sorts.
Yeah, yes. Many divisions within a multinational state. And then you, sir.
Keith Raffan, former MP and MSP. Haven't you yourself played with identity politics when the Leave campaign didn't just suggest, but stated that 80 million Turks could decamp to England? Wasn't that dog whistle politics of the nastiest kind? And the second point, very briefly, is that you paint a very rosy picture of the Union, but Brexit has placed an unprecedented strain on the Union, totally avoidable, as seen in the vote in the Scottish Parliament last week, and the ongoing debate over the border between the north and the south of Ireland.
Okay.
On the first point, to a friend from and colleague from Cyprus, I briefly mentioned in response to Jason's earlier question the strains that almost all developed nations have felt in the wake of the 2008 economic crash, and it's certainly the case. I won't go into detail country by country because I think that would be disobliging to other countries. But if we look at other European countries, they themselves have their strains and their difficulties, which democratic leaders are wrestling with, and I think that the point that you make about nostalgia and Empire 2.0 reflects a particular analysis of the Brexit vote. There are some who argue that it was a deliberately backward-looking approach, but actually, if one looks at history, one can see that many of those who were keenest on the idea of imperial power and a special role for Britain that would replace what the empire had stood for, these were people who were strongly pro-European. And that actually the Brexit vote in some respects is an attempt to ensure that instead of Britain feeling that the EU is an extension of empire by other means, that Britain should be a normal nation state. And that it should play its role in the affairs of other nations as an equal rather than as a nostalgist trying to use institutions in order to live in the past. On Keith's point, one thing I should point out to people who may not know is that Keith went to my school. In fact, he's one of the few people who went to my school ever elected to the... I know exactly, ever elected to the House of Commons, and Keith was also a distinguised member of. Well, I won't say which.
Stop praising him. Answer the question.
The truth is that, that with Scottish nationalists and for that matter Irish nationalists, particularly the Sinn Féin kind, any excuse will do. If it wasn't Brexit, it would be something else. The truth is that for the Scottish Nationalist Party, they will find a reason. They will find a grievance. In order to say that there needs to be another referendum. You join the Scottish Nationalist Party because you want Scotland to be an independent country. And ultimately, that is their policy and everything else is tactical. So we can't...
But something must be driving their frustration with the United Kingdom. I mean, the Scottish nationalists for a long time have spoken of a democratic deficit. 62% of Scots voted to remain in the European Union, Michael, as you well know. How do you think they feel about being dragged out of the European Union by England?
Well, I don't think that 62% of people voted that the UK should stay in the European Union. And of course, at the last general election, people were asked again which political traditions and which political parties they wanted to vote for, and we found that they voted for
which is why they now want to break away.
But I think the basic point is that the SNP, with its skillful political leaders, will find any reason. And I think that there is an argument from fear. Should we allow a nationalist veto to prevent us from doing anything.
My question was not about the SNP, it was about your stance.
Yes, I know.
On people from Turkey. The United Kingdom.
So you're saying Michael's campaign was xenophobic? Is
yes, I'm saying that it was.
Do others agree with that?
It's worse, far worse than the SNP.
Is that unfair, Michael?
I will have to respectfully disagree.
Okay. More questions. I'm aware that no woman's on. You've been patiently waiting in the front row, and I'm going to ask someone at the very back. Sir, with your right hand raised in the...
Owen Bennett, Huffington Post. Michael, just to pick you up on this, you said that the SNP played with identity politics in order to advance their position. I must take you back to the Turkey point. How was that not playing with identity politics in order to advance the position of Brexit? Can you explain to me why that wasn't playing with identity politics?
Yes, the reason why I think the Leave campaign won is because people wanted to make sure that we could have control of our borders, of our taxes, of our laws, and all of that was part of a broader campaign to restore faith in our democratic institutions. And one of the striking things, again, which people looking at the referendum campaign and its aftermath often omit, but people like Alex Massey and Sunil Katwala have acknowledged, is that the referendum campaign has led to Britain becoming more welcoming towards migration and more open to new people arriving here.
Richard Hayton from University of Leeds. To what extent, Michael, is your understanding of unionism dependent on the continued presence of Northern Ireland as part of the UK? Or could your notion of the Union survive Northern Ireland's departure?
Well, I'm confident, and I think the most recent evidence from polling today shows it, that Northern Ireland will be in the United Kingdom for as far as the eye can see, as long as the mind can imagine. I think the support for a united Ireland in the most recent polling is just over 20%. So, of course, there are some delicate issues that will be resolved as we leave the European Union, which ensure that the interests of people on either side of the Irish border are respected and enhanced. But I'm confident that the wish of the overwhelming majority of people in Northern Ireland to stay part of the United Kingdom will continue to be respected. And I think that it's a good thing if people want to be part of your country. So whether or not it's the majority of people in Northern Ireland who want to be part of the United Kingdom, or people who want to come here in order to make a new life, that reflects well on your country, that people want to be in it rather than to leave it.
Do you think the United Kingdom is, as the Cambridge historian David Reynolds has said, a mini English empire?
No, I don't think that. No. I think that it's impossible to understand the history. I mean, I do take the point, of course, that because England is the...
Well, England is the largest nation in Europe without its own political institutions.
Yes, but I think that that misunderstands the extent to which the other countries of the United Kingdom have had a profound influence on the UK. I think it's impossible, for example, to imagine the 20th century without the radicalism of Welsh politicians. So whether it's David Lloyd George or an Iron Bevan, their influence has been profound. I think it's impossible to imagine the last 200 years, either the imperial project or the creation of the institutions, some of which I mentioned here, without Scots. I don't think you could have had the BBC, either physically you couldn't have had television, and you certainly couldn't have had the BBC without the influence of Scots as well. I don't think that we would have won the Second World War without Bernard Montgomery and Lord Allenbrook from Northern Ireland. I think that, you know...
You're beginning to sound like Gordon Brown.
Well, that's a great compliment.
The gentleman's been waiting, standing at the very back, for your patience, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mark Devonport from BBC Northern Ireland. Really picking up on that last question about Northern Ireland. Why are you so confident if, according to the Times' recent report, Theresa May told Jacob Rees-Mogg that she wasn't confident about a border poll? And in relation to the results in Northern Ireland, do you think support for the Union has been strengthened by Brexit, or is this latest result despite Brexit?
I think that I wasn't in the conversation that the Prime Minister had with my colleague, but one thing I do know about the Prime Minister, one of the many things I know about the Prime Minister, is that she's absolutely determined and committed to maintaining the strength and the solidity of the UK and doesn't want to take any risks at that, and will take every opportunity to find the right answer for people living in Northern Ireland and for our neighbours and friends in order to ensure that the Union remains strong and that we maintain good relations with all those with whom we have close commercial, political and personal ties. As for what might have been the case at a different time in a different alternate universe in that poll, I don't know, but it is for me personally reassuring that notwithstanding the important issues that still remain to be addressed, that the majority of people, the overwhelming majority of people in Northern Ireland, want to remain in the United Kingdom.
I'm afraid Dean Godson has, rather like the shopkeeper of Mr. Ben, has appeared at the back of the room, and he's sort of drawn a horizontal line in the air, which is either means I'm in trouble or we have to end. You may disagree with Michael Gove, but I think we all admire his courtesy and his eloquence. So thank you, Michael.
Thank you.